We're told that for a British star, making it in America is the ultimate dream. But for these 15 legends, Hollywood wasn't a land of opportunity. It was a professional graveyard. Behind the glitz of the Oscars lay scandals so explosive they triggered FBI bans, national boycotts, and even direct condemnation from the Vatican. These icons were worshipped by the American public until the mask slipped. From home wrecker labels to public arrests and tragic suicides, they didn't just lose their fans. They lost their right to work in the country that made them millions. Today, we're stripping away the PR gloss to examine the British stars whose American lives were systematically dismantled. At number 1 is Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin was the most recognizable face on the planet, a British citizen who spent 4 decades building the American film industry from the ground up. To the American public, he was the lovable Little, a symbol of the common man's struggle. However, while he was making millions laugh, he was privately navigating a series of explosive scandals involving marriages to teenagers and increasingly radical political leanings. He lived in a state of permanent tension with the American establishment, who viewed his personal conduct as a direct threat to the country's moral fabric. The reality of Chaplin's private life was a cycle of messy divorces and paternity suits that the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover used as leverage to build a case against him. Hoover viewed Chaplin not as an artist, but as a dangerous alien influence. While the public saw a comic genius, the government saw a man whose scandalous choices, including a marriage to an 18-year-old Una O'Neill when he was 54, made him the perfect target for a national purge. He was a man living a double life, a global icon on screen, and a monitored target of the state off-screen. The breaking point came in 1952. While Chaplin was traveling to London for a movie premiere, the U.S. government revoked his re-entry permit. They effectively exiled the man who had shaped Hollywood for 40 years, citing moral turpitude and political suspicion. He was a man without a country, forced to settle in Switzerland, permanently barred from the land where he had achieved his greatest success. The American dream hadn't just ended for Chaplin. It had been forcibly taken away by the authorities. Chaplin spent the rest of his life in a state of bitter reflection, only returning to the U.S. decades later to accept an honorary Oscar. He had been the ultimate victim of the Hollywood machine, used for his genius, and then discarded the moment his private life became politically inconvenient. He proved that even the most powerful star in the world could be erased by the state if their private reality didn't align with the public's expectations. Today, Chaplin is remembered as a pioneer, but his story serves as a clinical reminder of how fragile fame truly is. He was a man who gave everything to the American screen, only to be branded an undesirable and cast out. His affair with America ended in a cold, bureaucratic exile that shadowed his legacy until the day he died. At number 2 is Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman was the personification of saintly virtue in Hollywood, famous for her role in Casablanca. To the American audience, she was the pure star, a woman who radiated a wholesome natural grace that set her apart from the typical glamour girls. She was worshipped for her apparent moral clarity, a reputation that made her one of the most bankable and respected actresses in the country. She was the star the public felt they could trust implicitly. That trust was shattered in 1949 when Bergman, while still married to Peter Lindstrom, began a highly public affair with Italian director Roberto Rossellini. The scandal was compounded when she became pregnant with Rossellini's child before her divorce was finalized. The American reaction was not just a tabloid frenzy. It was a national moral crisis. The woman who had played Joan of Arc was now being branded a fallen woman by the very people who had once placed her on a pedestal. The fallout was unprecedented in its severity. Bergman was denounced on the floor of the U.S. Senate, where she was labeled a powerful influence for evil. She received thousands of letters of hate mail and was effectively blacklisted by the Hollywood studios that had once fought for her. She had moved from being a national treasure to a national pariah overnight, forced to flee the United States and settle in Italy to escape the relentless public shaming. For years, Bergman lived in a state of professional exile, her American career dead and buried. She lived a double life in Europe, continuing to act, but knowing she was persona non grata in the world's biggest film market. The scandal had stripped her of her high prestige standing, proving that Hollywood's love was entirely conditional on a performer maintaining a specific narrow version of morality. She was a victim of her own honesty in an industry that preferred a comfortable lie. Bergman eventually won her way back into Hollywood's graces years later, winning another Oscar, but the scars of her American affair never fully healed. She had seen the darkest side of the American public's obsession with celebrity virtue. Her story remains a definitive look at how quickly a star can be destroyed when their private search for happiness clashes with their public brand of purity. At number 3 is Richard Burton. Richard Burton was the man with the million-dollar voice, a Shakespearean heavyweight who was supposed to be the next great leader of the British acting tradition. When he arrived in Hollywood, he was viewed as a figure of immense intellectual and masculine power. To the American public, he was a serious artist, a man who brought a sense of traditional weight to the screen. He was a star whose talent suggested a life of professional discipline and traditional standing. Everything changed on the set of Cleopatra in 1962. Burton's affair with Elizabeth Taylor, while both were married to other people, became the most documented scandal in the history of the world. It was a lust scandal that moved beyond the movie industry and into the realm of international morality. The couple lived their lives in a state of permanent pursuit by the paparazzi, their every move documented and judged by a global audience that was both obsessed and repulsed. The level of condemnation was staggering. The Vatican issued an open letter denouncing their erotic vagrancy, and members of the U.S. Congress even suggested that Burton's visa should be revoked on moral grounds. He was no longer seen as a serious actor. He had become one half of a scandalous tabloid duo. He lived a double life where his immense talent was consistently overshadowed by the chaos of his romantic life, a reality that deeply embittered him as he realized his artistic legacy was being eroded. Burton and Taylor's affair essentially invented the modern celebrity culture of excess and scandal. For Burton, the cost was his reputation as the great actor of his generation. He became a man who was famous for being famous, a star whose private addictions and romantic entanglements were more discussed than his performances. He spent the rest of his career in a cycle of high-paid Hollywood roles and personal self-destruction, never quite regaining the artistic purity he had when he first arrived in the U.S. He died in 1984, leaving a legacy of what might have been. His American career was a series of massive hits and massive scandals, a life lived under a microscope that ultimately destroyed his health and his peace of mind. He proved that in the eyes of the American public, a great talent can easily be eclipsed by a great scandal, and that the Vatican-level condemnation of his private life was a weight he could never truly shake off. At number 4 is George Sanders. George Sanders was the personification of the sophisticated villain, an actor whose velvet voice and aristocratic sneer made him a pillar of classic cinema. To the American public, he was a figure of immense wit and professional poise who seemed to glide through the industry with effortless superiority. He was viewed as a stable intellectual force, the kind of actor who provided a sense of traditional weight to every project he touched. Behind the scenes, Sanders was navigating a private reality defined by a series of messy, high-stakes affairs and 4 failed marriages. His chaotic personal life began to erode his standing as his reputation for being difficult and cynical made him a risky prospect for major studios. He lived a double life where his on-screen elegance was a mask for a man who was increasingly bored with his own fame and disgusted by the industry that sustained him. The conflict lay in his inability to reconcile his intellectual arrogance with the reality of a fading career. As the Hollywood system changed, Sanders found himself relegated to lesser roles, his refined brand no longer in high demand. He spent his final years in a state of professional and financial decline, his secret shame being the loss of the fortune he had spent decades building through his work in the United States. Sanders' American journey ended in a bleak hotel room in Spain in 1972. He left behind a suicide note famously stating he was bored. But the clinical truth was a man who had been hollowed out by personal scandals and a sense of irrelevance. He died alone and penniless, a stark contrast to the luxurious image he had projected for 40 years. He proved that in the brutal economy of Hollywood, even a celebrated winner can be discarded once their private life becomes a burden. His legacy remains one of the most chilling examples of the Hollywood affair gone wrong. He was a man who had everything, the awards, the voice, the status, but who couldn't survive the collapse of his own carefully constructed persona. He serves as a reminder that the most sophisticated masks are often the ones hiding the most profound and terminal sense of loneliness. At number 5 is Rex Harrison. Rex Harrison was the definitive leading man, a star of the stage and screen who brought an air of absolute authority to Hollywood. To the American audience, he was Sexy Rexy, a man of wit and effortless style who represented the peak of British class. He was a performer whose reputation was built on a foundation of theatrical excellence and a public image of charm that made him a favorite of the social elite. That image was permanently shattered in 1948 by his affair with the young American actress Carol Landis. While Harrison was still married to Lily Palmer, Landis became obsessed with him, leading to a volatile and desperate relationship that the Hollywood press began to track with predatory interest. Harrison lived a double life, where he performed the role of the dignified actor by day while navigating a private world of intense emotional turmoil by night. The scandal turned into a nightmare when Landis took her own life after Harrison reportedly told her he would never leave his wife. It was Harrison himself who found her body, and his subsequent attempts to downplay the affair to the police and the press only fueled a massive public backlash. He was branded a cad and a coward by the American public, and for a time he became a total pariah in the industry that had once worshipped him. The fallout was a period of professional exile, where Harrison was forced to flee Hollywood and return to the London stage to rebuild his reputation. He had seen his career nearly erased by a single tragic romantic choice. He spent the next decade in a state of professional vigilance, working twice as hard to regain the standing he had lost. The scandal proved that Hollywood's tolerance for gentlemanly affairs ended the moment those affairs led to a public tragedy. Harrison eventually returned to win an Oscar for My Fair Lady, but the Carol Landis scandal remained a dark shadow over his American legacy. He proved that a star's charm can be a dangerous weapon, and that the distance between a romantic lead and a public villain is much shorter than most performers realize. He remained a man who was respected for his talent, but never truly forgiven for the reality of his private conduct. At number 6 is Vivien Leigh. Vivien Leigh was the ethereal star who captured the American heart as Scarlett O'Hara, a woman whose beauty and fragile talent made her a symbol of cinematic perfection. To the public, she was a figure of absolute grace, the queen of the stage who had conquered Hollywood with a single performance. She was viewed as a priceless asset, a star whose presence guaranteed a film's artistic and commercial success. The hidden reality of Leigh's American career was a struggle with severe, unrecognized mental health issues that were exacerbated by the pressures of Hollywood. During the filming of Elephant Walk in 1953, her manic behavior and a highly public affair with co-star Peter Finch led to a total breakdown on set. She was a woman living a double life, a professional icon in the eyes of the world, and a woman in a state of total psychological collapse behind closed doors. The conflict reached a breaking point when she was fired from the production and replaced by Elizabeth Taylor. The news of her conduct and her removal from the film was a massive blow to her professional standing in America. She was effectively sent back to England in disgrace, her reputation as a reliable leading lady destroyed. The very industry that had crowned her royalty now viewed her as a professional liability. Leigh lived the rest of her life in a state of permanent internal and professional exile from the Hollywood peak she once occupied. She was a woman who had been worked for her beauty, but was discarded the moment her health made her difficult for the studios to manage. She had seen the darkest side of the American star system, a machine that demands perfection and has no room for human fragility or secret suffering. She died in 1967, and while she remains a legend, Her story is a clinical reminder of the high price of the Hollywood mask. She proved that the most perfect public faces often hide the most profound private pain. Her American affair was a tragedy in 3 acts: a meteoric rise, a scandalous collapse, and a final quiet disappearance from the land that had once made her a queen. At number 7 is Laurence Olivier. Sir Laurence Olivier was arguably the most respected actor of the 20th century, a man who brought Shakespearean weight to the American screen. To the public, he was the personification of British prestige, a man of deep discipline and immense dignity. His marriage to Vivien Leigh was viewed as the ultimate romantic legend, a union of 2 massive stars that represented the absolute peak of cultural achievement. To the American audience, they were the king and queen of the arts, a couple whose private lives were expected to be as flawless as their stage performances. However, behind this mask of theatrical royalty, Olivier was navigating a private reality of intense internal conflict and clandestine affairs. When he first arrived in Hollywood to film Wuthering Heights, his affair with Vivien Leigh, while both were married to others, was a massive professional risk. They lived in a state of permanent tension, knowing that a single public slip would destroy their chances of conquering the American market. Olivier was forced to perform the role of a stable, respectable artist for the cameras while privately managing a domestic life defined by betrayal and secret hotel meetings. The conflict lay in the exhausting demand for absolute moral perfection. Olivier understood that the American studio system and the public perception of decency were the only things between him and professional ruin. He lived a double life, presenting a facade of artistic devotion while engaging in hundreds of secret encounters that stood in total contrast to his public image. He was a man who understood that in Hollywood your talent is only as valuable as your reputation, and he worked tirelessly to ensure the two never clashed in the headlines. Despite the power couple status he eventually achieved, the strain of maintaining this illusion took a massive toll. His marriage to Leigh was plagued by her deteriorating health and his own serial infidelities, creating a private hell that was hidden behind glowing press releases. Olivier was a man who had mastered the art of the hidden truth, proving that the most authoritative public figures are often the ones carrying the heaviest burdens of secrecy to protect their standing in the industry. He died in 1989, and while his artistic legacy is untouched, his story is a clinical reminder of the double lives forced upon those at the top. He proved that even the most respected star is essentially a performer, not just on the set, but in every social interaction. His American career was a masterpiece of image management, a life spent ensuring the public never saw the volatile, complicated man behind the legendary Shakespearean mask. At number 8 is Cary Grant. Cary Grant was the ultimate Hollywood leading man, suave, witty, and possessed of a perfect gentleman brand that made him a global icon. Born Archibald Leach in Bristol, he spent his American career meticulously constructing a persona that was the envy of every man and the desire of every woman. To the public, he was the personification of effortless class, a star who seemed to have navigated the Hollywood system without a single smudge on his reputation. He was the safe, bankable hero that America trusted implicitly. The reality, however, was a life defined by deep-seated insecurity and a carefully guarded private life. Grant lived in a state of permanent vigilance, protecting a series of secrets that could have ended his career in the 1940s and 50s. His 5 marriages were often viewed as attempts to maintain a conventional image, while persistent rumors about his private relationships and his bachelor lifestyle in Hollywood threatened the very foundation of his brand. He was a man who lived a double life, where the Cary Grant persona was a shield against a world that might not have accepted the real Archie Leach. The conflict for Grant was the psychological pressure of playing a character 24 hours a day. He famously once said, "Everyone wants to be Cary Grant. Even I want to be Cary Grant." This admission revealed the exhausting nature of his existence. He was a man who felt like a fraud, constantly terrified that his messy divorces and private experiments with LSD would leak into the mainstream. He understood that, in the American eyes of that era, Any deviation from the gentleman's script would lead to a total loss of status and professional exile. His divorces were particularly toxic, with allegations of control and coldness that stood in stark contrast to his charming on-screen presence. He navigated the Hollywood legal system with the same precision he used for his film roles, ensuring that the darker details of his domestic life remained buried in court records or settled quietly out of court. He was a master of the hidden reality, a man who realized that in the American star system, the image is often more important than the truth. Grant died in 1986, and while he remains the gold standard of leading men, his story serves as a reminder of the cost of total image control. He proved that the most perfect stars are often the ones struggling the most to reconcile their true selves with their public identities. His American affair was a lifelong performance, a brilliant, successful deception that allowed him to remain a king while keeping his true identity a closely guarded industry secret. At number 9 is Peter Lawford. Peter Lawford was the charming British aristocrat of the Rat Pack, a man whose proximity to power and celebrity made him a fixture of the American elite. To the public, he was the sophisticated link between Hollywood and the political world, especially after his marriage to Patricia Kennedy, sister of John F. Kennedy. He was viewed as a man of immense social standing, a star who occupied a unique position at the intersection of glamour and national authority. He was the personification of the British success story in the heart of the American establishment. However, Lawford's life was a destructive cycle of dependency and exploitation. He found himself caught between the demands of Frank Sinatra's Rat Pack and the cold political requirements of the Kennedy family. He was often used as a fixer or a social bridge, a role that saw him navigating a private reality of intense drug use and clandestine social arrangements. He lived a double life where his refined public image was a mask for a man who was increasingly used and eventually discarded by the very people he sought to serve. The fallout was a professional and social collapse that saw him cast out by both Hollywood and the Kennedys. Following the death of Marilyn Monroe and the changing political landscape after the JFK assassination, Lawford found himself a pariah. His involvement in the darker, hidden side of the administration's social life made him a liability. He went from being a member of the inner circle to a man whose calls were no longer returned, a Hollywood affair that ended in a cold public rejection. As his career declined, Lawford's private struggles with addiction became impossible to hide. The gentleman persona eroded, revealing a man who had lost his fortune and his relevance. He spent his final years in a state of professional decline, taking minor roles in B-movies and television shows that were far beneath his previous standing. He was a man who had flown too close to the sun of American power and was left with nothing but the scorched remains of a once prominent career. Lawford died in 1984, a tragic example of how proximity to power can destroy a performer's soul. He proved that, in the American system, you're only as valuable as your latest connection, and that the moment you become a social or political risk, you are erased. His story is a definitive look at the hidden shame of the Rat Pack era, a man who lived a life of ultimate access but died as an outcast in the country that had once treated him like royalty. At number 10 is Hugh Grant. Hugh Grant was the definitive 1990s golden boy, a man whose stuttering, self-deprecating charm in 4 weddings and a funeral made him the face of British romance in America. To the public, he was the safe, floppy-haired intellectual, a man of clear breeding and effortless decency. He was viewed as a high-prestige actor who had successfully conquered the U.S. market without the typical Hollywood aggression. He was the star every American talk show host wanted on their couch, representing a polite and polished version of English masculinity. This image of the perfect gentleman was violently dismantled in 1995 when Grant was arrested in Los Angeles for lewd conduct with a sex worker named Divine Brown. The mugshot that followed became one of the most famous images in the history of celebrity scandals. It was a clinical shock to the American system. The man who was currently dating the most beautiful woman in the world, Elizabeth Hurley, had been caught in a sordid public act on Sunset Boulevard. The gap between the stuttering romantic hero and the man in the back of a police car was a chasm that few thought he could cross. The conflict for Grant was the immediate demand for a public apology in a country that values moral redemption. He was facing a total blacklisting from the U.S. studios that had hundreds of millions of dollars invested in his clean image. He lived a double life in the weeks following the arrest, performing the role of the shamed penitent on late-night television while privately navigating a career that was on the verge of total collapse. He understood that, in the American eyes of the 90s, he wasn't just being judged for an affair, but for the hypocrisy of his entire public brand. Unlike many of his predecessors, Grant's survival was a masterpiece of PR management. By going on The Tonight Show and simply admitting, "I did a bad thing," he managed to pivot from a pariah back to a person. However, the innocent phase of his American career was dead. The scandal fundamentally changed how he was cast, shifting him toward darker, more cynical CAD roles that eventually revealed a much deeper acting range. He proved that, while the American public loves a hero, they're obsessed with a sinner who is willing to confess. Today, Grant is respected for his longevity, but his 1995 arrest remains the definitive Hollywood affair moment. It serves as a reminder that a star's public face is often just a thin veneer over a much more complicated private reality. He survived the explosion, but he was never the golden boy again. He became a man who understood the mechanics of the Hollywood machine better than most, realizing that fame is a game where the only real sin is getting caught without a script for the apology. At number 11 is Russell Brand. Elizabeth Taylor was the ultimate British-American hybrid, a star who grew up under the microscope of the Hollywood studio system. To the public, she was the personification of high-status beauty, a woman whose violet eyes and legendary jewelry collection made her the queen of the silver screen. She was worshipped for her talent and her resilience, a child star who had successfully transitioned into the most famous woman in the world. However, in the late 1950s, the American public's adoration turned to cold clinical fury during the most famous home wrecker scandal in history. The scandal erupted when Taylor began an affair with singer Eddie Pfizer shortly after the tragic death of her husband, Mike Todd. Pfizer was currently married to Debbie Reynolds, who was seen as America's sweetheart. The resulting backlash was a national moral uprising. Taylor was branded a man-eater and a husband-stealer by a public that felt personally betrayed. She lived a double life where her immense professional success was overshadowed by a reputation that made her a social pariah in the very country that had raised her. The conflict for Taylor was the total collapse of her moral standing. She was facing a massive public boycott of her films, and many in Hollywood believed her career was finished. She was a woman who navigated a world of intense psychiatric stress and physical illness, all while being judged by a global audience. She understood that, in the American eyes of the time, she had committed the ultimate sin. She had broken the sisterhood of the Hollywood elite. The homewrecker label was a weight that threatened to sink her entire legacy. The pivot came when Taylor nearly died from pneumonia during the filming of Cleopatra. The American public, in their typical fashion, moved from hatred to sympathy overnight, and she was eventually awarded an Oscar as a get-well gift from the industry. However, the scars of the scandal remained. She lived the rest of her life in a state of permanent duality, viewed as both a goddess and a cautionary tale. She had seen the darkest side of the American obsession with celebrity morality, and she spent the rest of her life using her fame as a shield against further judgment. Taylor died in 2011, leaving a legacy of immense power and activism. She proved that while a star can survive a total moral collapse in America, they will never truly be safe again. Her American affair was a lifelong battle for autonomy against a public that felt they owned her story. She was a woman who mastered the Hollywood machine, realizing that the only way to beat the system was to become so famous that the scandals themselves became a part of the legend. At number 12 is Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was the ultimate British-American hybrid, a star who grew up under the microscope of the Hollywood studio system. To the public, she was the personification of high-status beauty, a woman whose violet eyes and legendary jewelry collection made her the queen of the silver screen. She was worshipped for her talent and her resilience, a child star who had successfully transitioned into the most famous woman in the world. However, in the late 1950s, the American public's adoration turned to cold clinical fury during the most famous home wrecker scandal in history. The scandal erupted when Taylor began an affair with singer Eddie Pfizer shortly after the tragic death of her husband, Mike Todd. Pfizer was currently married to Debbie Reynolds, who was seen as America's sweetheart. The resulting backlash was a national moral uprising. Taylor was branded a man-eater and a husband-stealer by a public that felt personally betrayed. She lived a double life where her immense professional success was overshadowed by a reputation that made her a social pariah in the very country that had raised her. The conflict for Taylor was the total collapse of her moral standing. She was facing a massive public boycott of her films, and many in Hollywood believed her career was finished. She was a woman who navigated a world of intense psychiatric stress and physical illness, all while being judged by a global audience. She understood that, in the American eyes of the time, she had committed the ultimate sin. She had broken the sisterhood of the Hollywood elite. The Homewrecker label was a weight that threatened to sink her entire legacy. The pivot came when Taylor nearly died from pneumonia during the filming of Cleopatra. The American public, in their typical fashion, moved from hatred to sympathy overnight, and she was eventually awarded an Oscar as a get-well gift from the industry. However, the scars of the scandal remained. She lived the rest of her life in a state of permanent duality, viewed as both a goddess and a cautionary tale. She had seen the darkest side of the American obsession with celebrity morality, and she spent the rest of her life using her fame as a shield against further judgment. Taylor died in 2011, leaving a legacy of immense power and activism. She proved that while a star can survive a total moral collapse in America, they will never truly be safe again. Her American affair was a lifelong battle for autonomy against a public that felt they owned her story. She was a woman who mastered the Hollywood machine, realizing that the only way to beat the system was to become so famous that the scandals themselves became a part of the legend. At number 13 is James Corden. James Corden arrived in the United States with a carefully curated persona of the lovable underdog, the singing, laughing Brit who just wanted to be everyone's best friend. After the massive success of Carpool Karaoke, he was viewed by millions as the personification of wholesome late-night joy. To the American public, he was a refreshing change of pace, a high-energy star who brought a sense of musical theater enthusiasm to the U.S. television landscape. He was the safe, bankable choice for major awards shows and big-budget musicals, representing a polished version of British everyman charm. However, behind the singing and the smiles, a different reputation began to leak into the public consciousness. Reports of behavioral scandals and a history of being difficult with service staff and colleagues started to erode his nice guy brand. He lived a double life. The exuberant, welcoming host on camera and a man accused of elitist and abrasive behavior off camera. This disconnect created a clinical shift in how the American audience perceived him. He was no longer the charming outsider, but a performer whose public warmth was increasingly viewed as an artificial performance. The conflict reached a breaking point with a highly publicized ban from a famous New York restaurant, where his conduct was called out by the owner. The resulting fallout was a massive vibe shift across social media and mainstream press. He found himself in a state of professional crisis where the very people he relied on for views, the American middle class, began to view him with deep-seated suspicion. He had seen the reality of the U.S. market. Once the public decides you aren't authentic, the path back to their hearts is almost impossible to find. The hidden truth of Corden's Hollywood journey was the total collapse of his relatability. As the jokes became less frequent and the criticism more intense, he eventually announced his departure from late-night television to return to the UK. While he framed it as a family decision, the industry saw it as a tactical retreat from a market that had fundamentally turned against him. He was a man who had conquered the American screen, only to find that his brand of charm had an expiration date once the real man was glimpsed by the public. Corden's story is a definitive look at the modern celebrity cycle of hype and hate. He proved that, In the American eyes of the 2020s, a reputation for being difficult is the ultimate career poison. His American Affair was a decade-long performance that ended with a quiet exit, leaving behind a legacy of immense commercial success and a cautionary tale about the importance of protecting the persona at all costs. He remains a man whose career proves that you can sing with the stars, but you can't survive if you lose the trust of the audience. At number 14 is Piers Morgan. Piers Morgan arrived in America with a reputation as a fierce, unapologetic journalist, a man who wasn't afraid to take on the most powerful figures in the world. He was hired to fill the legendary shoes of Larry King, a move that suggested he was a man of immense professional standing and intellectual weight. To the American public, he was the straight-talking Brit who would bring a sense of rigorous inquiry back to cable news. He was a high-value asset for CNN, a man whose presence was expected to redefine the late-night news hour with a sense of British authority. However, Morgan's confrontational style and his refusal to adapt to the nuances of the American cultural landscape quickly turned him into a polarizing figure. His vocal stance on sensitive U.S. issues, particularly gun control, led to a petition to have him deported in a massive clash with the core values of his American audience. He lived a double life, a respected editor and judge in the UK, and a man increasingly viewed as an arrogant interloper in the United States. He failed to realize that the shock-jock journalism that worked in London required a much more delicate touch in the heart of the U.S. media machine. The fallout was a high-profile exit from CNN as his ratings cratered and his public standing dissolved. He went from being the heir apparent of American news to a man whose views were actively rejected by both sides of the political aisle. He had seen the clinical reality of the U.S. industry. If you alienate the audience by challenging their cultural identity, they will switch the channel and never look back. He was a man whose American Affair ended not in a scandal of the heart, but in a total failure of cultural translation. Following his U.S. departure, Morgan returned to the U.K., where he continued to cultivate his brand as a professional contrarian. His attempt to conquer American television is now viewed as a case study in fame clash, where a star's personality is fundamentally at odds with the market they are trying to lead. He proved that even the most confident performer cannot survive in America if they refuse to understand the hidden rules of the audience they are serving. Today, Morgan remains a powerful media figure, but his time in the U.S. is a permanent mark of professional rejection. He remains a man whose American journey was defined by conflict rather than conversation. He proved that a British accent and a sharp wit are not enough to sustain a career in a country that values cultural alignment as much as it values entertainment. His story is a reminder that the Hollywood machine is designed to reward those who fit in, not those who try to tear it down from the inside. At number 15 is Stan Laurel. Stan Laurel was one half of Laurel and Hardy, the most beloved comedy duo in the history of the world, a British citizen who moved to America to find his fortune. He was viewed by the public as the innocent half of the team, a man of childlike simplicity and comedic genius. To the American audience, he was a symbol of pure slapstick joy, a star who had successfully bridged the gap between the silent era and the talkies with effortless grace. He was the personification of the hard-working artist who had helped build Hollywood's foundations. Behind the laughter, however, Laurel's private life in America was a chaotic cycle of 8 marriages to 4 different women and a series of messy, high-profile divorces that drained his fortune. He lived a double life, the simpleton on screen and the sophisticated, often troubled man of the world off-screen. His legal battles with his ex-wives were a constant source of hidden shame that the studios worked hard to keep out of the headlines to protect the duo's family-friendly brand. He was a man who spent his life creating laughter while navigating a private reality of intense financial and emotional stress. The conflict for Laurel was the total drain on his resources and his creative energy. Each divorce led to a new round of lawsuits and alimony payments that left him perpetually on the edge of financial ruin. He understood that his career was a fragile thing and that a single public scandal regarding his predatory or unstable domestic life would destroy the Laurel and Hardy image. He was a man who performed his roles with absolute precision on screen while performing a much more difficult role in the courtroom, fighting to keep his life and his career from collapsing under the weight of his personal choices. The hidden reality was that, while the world thought he was a millionaire, Laurel was often struggling to make ends meet due to the costs of his serial marriages. He navigated the Hollywood system with a sense of quiet desperation, taking roles and tours he didn't want just to stay ahead of his legal debts. He had seen the darkest side of the American legal and celebrity machine, a system that rewards the image of the happy artist while systematically stripping them of their autonomy and their wealth. Laurel died in 1965, and while he is worshipped as a god of comedy, his story is a clinical reminder of the high prestige cost of fame. He proved that even the most innocent stars can be consumed by the demands of the American dream. His American affair was a life of ultimate creative success and ultimate personal turmoil. A man who gave the world laughter but lived a private life defined by the cold, hard reality of the Hollywood.